Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and this is a Mindfields. This is episode 272. We are now at February the 13th of 2025. Happy Valentine's Day to you if I don't see you again before tomorrow. It's nice to have it on a Friday, isn't it? And we can hopefully have a relaxing weekend, emphasizing the more important side of life, the affection and love that we have for our spouses and family and community and environment and the world and universe and all the stars in the sky and so many things that are so much more important than the merely secular, I guess, aspect of life. But that's what we get caught up in, and that's how they get us into these wars, because we focus on the details instead of the big picture. The fail to see the forest for the trees, I guess, is a good way to put it. Anyway, good morning. Once again, I've got a stack of books in front of me, and I hope I don't jumble them up too badly, but I want to just to give you a preface here of this is a show that I've been wanting to do for some time, and it probably the first of a number of them. And perhaps the idea of studying Catholic religion in the 40s and 50s is kind of a dull subject, but it's not to me, because this is the background that I need to understand my father and to understand a very, very important man named General Joseph F. Carroll. General Carroll was the head of the DIA, not the CIA, the DIA. And it's very interesting to me that when my dad was recruited to go to the Pentagon from the FBI to work under the new office created by President Kennedy to take the special ops away from the CIA, called SACSA, two of the three men that signed his form, his civil service form to get employed by civil service system as opposed to the FBI. Anyway, two of the guys that signed his as character references were with the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which was only created in 1959, but is very mysterious still to me as to exactly why they created this Defense Intelligence Agency. Of course, you hear, that it was to bring together all the intelligence of the different services and to avoid duplication. But it also extends power in a very interesting way from J. Edgar Hoover into the U.S. Air Force, where General Carroll was. He was an Air Force general. And from there into the Vietnam War and the unfortunate disaster that Vietnam War was. So the interesting thing is that Joseph F. Carroll was a very devout Catholic. And his son, James Carroll, wrote a book about growing up in the Carroll family, which I have started reading. I have not finished it, but I have absorbed enough of it to see that his life and my life are very, very interestingly related. James Carroll is 10 years older than me. So I was born in 52. He was born in 42. So there's a kind of a time lag between us. And there are significant differences in his upbringing and mine, but there are more similarities than there are differences. And so while I am trying to introduce the important effect of Pope Pius XII on American thinking and American Catholics like my dad, I'm also revealing a part of a personal story that may help others who grew up with this Catholic upbringing as I did. It's a nicely written book. I haven't finished it yet, but I want to just go ahead and share some of it with you. The other books that I have at hand are Hitler's Pope, a book I devoured about 4 years ago, The Secret History of Pius XII by John Cornwell. And if you're really into understanding this stuff, definitely read Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell. He has an interesting and worthwhile passage here on page 215. I'll read this to you. It's when Pope Pacelli, his name is Eugenio Pacelli. He's from the elite North Italian families that have always controlled the papacy up until recently. As he looked out upon the powerful forces assembling for war, okay, this is in the late 30s, Pacelli could call on the loyalty and devotion of 500 million souls. Indeed, half the population of Hitler's new Greater Reich was Catholics, including a quarter of the SS, and this at a time when the bishops, clergy, religious, and faithful were bound together in unprecedented unity of discipline. Pacelli had no armies to call upon, but half a century of burgeoning centrist papal authority gave him extraordinary sway over the hearts and minds of the Catholic faithful. The Pope, by his own self-estimation, was the supreme arbiter of moral values on earth. And in consequence, his responsibilities were all the more remarkable. How would the institution of the papacy, how would Pacelli, the man who embodied that institution, live up to the challenges ahead, the most extraordinary challenges in the church's long history? Well, you can see that he's already seized the moral high ground by basically proclaiming that he is the supreme moral authority in the world. And if you're a Catholic, it's kind of hard not to accept that, isn't it? Because you have to believe that the Pope is the literal bridge between us and God. And if the Pope says it, you better believe it. Now, another book I'm going to get to, but not today, is this fascinating book that I got. It's a old beat up paperback copy, but it was the only one that I could find to buy, and it's called The American Pope. And of course, this is not about a real pope. This is about Francis Cardinal Spellman, the notorious Cardinal of New York City and the head of the Catholic Church in America, who was very, very much like Pacelli in his anti-communist zeal and his willingness to commit what other people would call war crimes, just to defeat communism and, install Catholic-friendly governments. Well, Pacelli is a real piece of work. I can't wait to dig into this book. It's a little hard to read because of the small print and the faded pages, but the parts that he talks about JFK, and it's very important to remember that the head of the Catholic Church in 1963, when JFK was killed, he's by now, the Pope now is Paul VI, by the way, Montini, who was the guy that collaborated with Allen Dulles in the Operation Sunrise with General Wolfe that we've talked about so many times on the show. And this particular account of Spellman and how he was able to get, otherwise, God-fearing good people to promote and participate in the Vietnam War. If it hadn't been for Spellman, we would not have gone to Vietnam. Probably President Kennedy might not have even been killed. I look forward to hearing more revelations as the revelations are coming out under our new president, President Trump's 47. And I know everyone's excited to see the confirmation of Bobby Kennedy Jr. as the head of, HHS, which is going on right now. So if you're watching that, I don't blame you. You can always catch up with me later. Frantz Peace, My Father. This is the book now, James Carroll, An American Requiem, and the subtitle's very important. God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us. My father. Not until years later did I appreciate how commanding was his presence. As a boy, I was aware of the admiring glances he drew as he walked into the officers' club, but I thought nothing of them. I used to see him in the corridors of the Pentagon, where I would go after school and then ride home with him. Well, my father had that same authoritative, commanding presence. And our neighbors, everybody that's ever spoken to me about him after he died has said, I mean, you felt that when he was in the room, everything was fine. That kind of just awesome, commanding presence. What else can I say? That's the first thing that I noticed that I have in common with James Carroll is our father had that aura. We always knew he loved us. The problem was his absolute assumption that the existing social context, the frame within which he'd found his extraordinary success, was immutable. His belief in the world of hierarchy was total, and his sense of himself as a father and as a general depended upon that world's survival. Defending it was his one real passion, his vocational commitment, and his religious duty. Okay. And yet, one early Sunday morning in winter, when I was perhaps 12 years old, he got up before dawn to drive me on my paper route. This was an unusual occurrence. I normally wrestled the papers onto my red wagon, even the thick Sunday editions. I hauled my own way in several cycles around our suburban neighborhood, Holland Hills, a new subdivision in Alexandria, Virginia. Okay, I have to stop and say Holland Hills is directly across the Potomac River from Fort Washington, Maryland, where I grew up. So this is the second resonance, is that he's grown up, 5-10 miles across the river from me in the neighborhood Holland Hills, which was a new neighborhood for him then. And I was growing up in a new neighborhood also called South Lawn, and then later Fort Foote. So we're across the river from each other. But a savage storm had moved in the night before, and now the wind was howling. Sheets of rain and sleet battered the windows. We bundled up and waited inside the front door until my distributor arrived. Then Dad and I hurried out to load my Washington Stars into the back seat of the Studebaker. The Washington Star was the second newspaper of Washington, not that well respected like the Post. But it came in the afternoon, and that gave us a new set of baseball scores and comic strips to look at. So I always welcomed when it came, too. The windshield wipers kept getting stuck in the building of grainy, in the buildup of ice, which we would scoop away as we returned from running the bulky papers up to the houses of my subscribers. Dad on his side of the street, me on mine. I'm going to skip ahead just to get to the point. We achieved a brilliant synchrony of teamwork that overstamped everything that might ever separate us. Drive, stop, fold, open the door, duck, dash, return. Way to go. Sir, if my father had been the commander of a two-man suicide mission, I'd have followed him, not out of any readiness to die, but out of the absolute trustworthiness of what bound us at that moment. I would have sworn that time itself could not undo it. quote, neither principalities nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, unquote. I was an altar boy. I was not, by the way. He was an altar boy, over whose head St. Paul usually sailed. But these words had lodged themselves in me. Paul, of course, was talking about the love of God, but my only real faith then was in the good order of the world over which Dad presided. And that's the way I think I probably felt too as a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old boy. Of course, my dad was still with the FBI then. Okay, just a little incident. Hey, you, a voice boomed. Even in that wind, I heard the threat in it. This was on the far side of Holland Hills, where the newer, smaller houses were. I didn't know them. The voice was a man, and it was laced with authority. Get back here, God damn it. My father stopped with his back to the man, still facing me. I searched his eyes to see what was in them, but the distance between us made it impossible. Get your ass back here. Put my paper where it belongs. I looked at Dad and saw that Dad had dropped the paper under the overhang protruding from the lintel, dry enough, but not quite at the threshold. I thought of making the dash myself to spare us all, but then I saw on a low post beside my father a sign with the luminous letters on it. Dad was looking at it too. Master Sergeant John Smith. Master Sergeant, I realized at once. This man was military. An NCO was barking orders at a general. Okay, they go through the story a little bit longer, and at the end of it, Dad brings the paper up to him, gives it to him, and James says, "What did he say, Dad?" He said, "Don't let it happen again, bub." And what did you say? I said, "No, sir." His face cracked open with pleasure, sheer triumph. Sir, even I knew that senior NCOs hated it when stupid punk recruits addressed them as if they were officers. Dad repeated, "No, sir." Then we laughed and laughed, heads back. He had that experience with his dad. I never had one quite that intimate, but I'm so glad that James did, because that kind of dad-father thing as a young boy is so important. And folks that don't get that at all, I sympathize. It's, I'm very much in favor of fatherhoods and fathers being active and, participating in adventures. Now, my dad took me on a canoe trip that I'll never forget. And I think that must be what I will hold on to as an equivalent. Chapter 1, in the Valley of the Bones. Catholics called it Our Lady of Perpetual Help, but to the Jews and Protestants who also took turns worshiping there, it was just the chapel. Mary's statue and the crucifix were mostly kept behind blue curtains. Air Force blue, the color of the carpeting, the needlepoint kneelers, and the pew cushion, and the pew cushions. The little white church with its steeple and clear glass Palladian windows could have been the pride of any New England town, but this was the base chapel at Bowling Air Force Base on the east bank of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. A block to one side, hangars loomed above it, and up the hill on the other side, a Georgian mansion, the officers' club, dwarfed the small church, a reminder of what really mattered here. Well, Bowling Air Force Base, we drove by it every time we went to D.C., and that, of course, is where I believe my dad learned his, what do they call it, photographic interpretation, studying of photographs for military intelligence purposes at the Naval Photography Lab, which is and was right there. And all became part of the Defense Intelligence Agency later, which is also at Bowling Air Force Base. No longer called Bowling Air Force Base, by the way, because now it is called Joint Base at Bowling, and everyone calls it JBAB. Well, that's the function of, the success of JSOC and putting together special forces as the preeminent military arm of the United States instead of, big divisions and armies. It's all about special forces and combined arms and the journey from where things were in the 50s to where we are now. People that don't study it or don't even have an awareness that it used to be different don't understand how weird it is to have the Joint Special Operations Command just running special ops all over the world that we don't even know about all the time. Another issue that I think is going to come up in the near future with President Trump, and I do hope so. Okay, he's writing about himself now and going to the chapel at Bolling Air Force Base. On a Saturday in February 1969, more than 200 people filed into the chapel. The statue of Mary and the wretched crucifix were on display. The paraphernalia of a Roman Catholic liturgy was laid out on the side table. The cruets, the covered chalice, the beeswax candles, the oversized red missal, which the chaplain's assistant would spell M-I-S-S-L-E. The congregation included Air Force officers in uniform since the event had the character of an official function. A number were generals who had come down from General's Row. These were the chairborne commanders of Operation Rolling Thunder, an air war that by then had dropped more bomb tonnage on a peninsula in Asia than the Army Air Corps ever dropped on Germany. The generals and their wives, easing down the center aisle, looked for their host and hostess and found them already seated in the front pew. They were Lieutenant General and Mrs. Joseph F. Carroll. He was the founding director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the man in charge of counting the enemy and evaluating targets in Vietnam. Today he wore civvies, but with his steely hair, fixed gaze, and erect posture, he looked like what he was. She, a staunch, chin-high Catholic woman, was nearly in possession of a lifelong Irish dream. She was the newly minted mother of a priest. Well, this is his ordination. This James Carroll decided to follow what he thought was his vocation and to become a priest. So that is the context in which he became a priest at Bolling Air Force Base. A few minutes later, the Air Force Chief of Chaplains, Major General Edwin Chess, by church rank a Monsignor, whom I had known since he accompanied Cardinal Spellman to our quarters for a Christmas visit at a base in Germany years before. Okay, now General Chess is like a best buddy of Spelly, of Cardinal Spellman. But here you have Chess and Spellman visiting the Carroll home when they were stationed in Germany years before this. And so General Chess says, in a day when our society is so disjointed, it is a great joy to know that Father Carroll is on our side. Now, referring to James Carroll as Father Carroll, the author here writes, what? On whose side? Excuse me. Pardon me. I was celebrating my first Mass here as tradition required. When I had entered the seminary a year after a year at Georgetown University, where I was named Outstanding Air Force ROTC cadet, it had been with the specific intention of becoming an Air Force chaplain myself. General Chess had been my spiritual director. Okay. On our side, quote unquote, when had that unambiguous phrase ceased to describe my position? Perhaps beginning in November 65, when, below my father's third floor window at the Pentagon, a 31-year-old Quaker named Norman Morrison set himself on fire. It took a couple of years, but by October 21st, 1967, I was standing on roughly the same spot below my father's window. No self-immolator. I merely chanted anti-war slogans, and I dared to do even that, only because tens of thousands of others stood chanting with me. I was sure it would never occur to my father that I was out there, and I was careful not to isolate myself from the throng. He never saw me. As a seminarian, I had embraced as an ideal Daniel Berrigan, the Jesuit priest and poet. Only months before my ordination, he and his brother led the infamous raid on the draft board offices in Catonsville, Maryland. On their side, compared to the Berrigan witness, my anonymous participation in Washington's massive anti-war demonstrations was the height of timidity. In secret, I had taken the stainless steel model B-52 bomber that was my prize for that ROTC award out to a ravine behind the seminary and hurled it, the napalm machine, into a fetid swamp. I remember its gleaming arc as my version of the gods dispelling in midair their annihilation, not ours, as Wallace Stevens had it. Quote, yet it left us feeling that in a measure we too had been annihilated, unquote. Those photographs of little slant-eyed people with melted chins and no eyelids and charred blue skin and fused fingers had given new meaning to the old word hit, as in hit of napalm. I had had dreams about the war, about flying airplanes in it, but my puerile fantasy had become a nightmare. Once I dreamed of crashing a jet plane into my parents' house, but it was all a secret and not just from them. When only a few months before, General Curtis LeMay, a 1968 vice presidential candidate, had put the most savage warmongering on display, I could not square my shame with the near worship I had felt for him as our next door neighbor at Bolling Air Force Base in the early 60s. Wow, so he knew Curtis LeMay. So he goes on to tell the story about when he gives his, uh, I've even forgotten, what do you call it, when the priest gives you a kind of a speech in the middle of the mass. Anyway, he gives his talk. And he talked about Ezekiel and the metaphor of the dry bones, and he refers that to, the prophet Ezekiel. Let's see. Yet news accounts not long before had described just such a scene in the valley below a besieged hilltop called Quezon. Curtis LeMay had proposed using nuclear weapons to break the siege. Casualties had mounted. 10,000 men had been killed in a matter of weeks. And that carnage was in my mind when I presumptuously chose Ezekiel's text as the starting point of my first proclamation as a priest. Dry bones. The metaphor rang in the air, a double-edged image of rebuke, cutting both ways, toward the literal Southeast Asian valleys of the dead and toward the realm of crushed hopes about which some of us had never dared to speak. Can these bones live? I now asked in my excursus. There, that's the word, excursus. Repeating Ezekiel's refrain, quote, dried and burned by time, I said, and by desert wind and by the sun, and most of all, I paused, knowing the offense it would be to use a word that tied the image to the real, the one word I must never use in this church, never use with them. By napalm, quote unquote. Well, you can imagine how well the speech went over from there. But He felt as a priest that he had the authority to say what he had said, and so he said it. In the Catholic Church to which I was born, the theology of the priesthood affirmed that the effect on a man, always a man, of the sacrament of orders was an ontological change, a transformation at the deepest level of one's essence and existence. It was an absurdly anachronistic notion, I would say now, but that morning I was living proof of it. My ordination in New York the previous day by His Eminence Terence Cardinal Cook, himself the military vicar, the warrior's godfather, had given me an authority I never felt before. In my first sermon as a priest, it prompted me to break the great rule of the separation of church and state, claiming an expertise not only about an abstract moral theology, but about its most specific application, an expertise that my father, for one, had never granted me. Quote, I was not ordained for this, unquote, I would have said, sensing the wound that my timid reference had opened in him, quote, but I can't help it, unquote. Chapter 2, J. Edgar, Joe, and Me. Well, he tells the story of his father. He grew up in Chicago in a tough Irish neighborhood. He was not among the elect or the elite, although the name Carroll goes way back in Catholic elite history. It's also a very common name now. So he was among the mix, I guess you might say. And he tells the story of in 1940, his father joined the FBI. Al Capone was already caught and had moved to Florida. Most of the other well-known Chicago hoodlums were on ice in the Illinois State Prison at Joliet. My father had only recently graduated from Loyola Law School. Notice Loyola, obviously Jesuit, right? A blue-collar night school in the Loop. During the day, for 6 years, it took to complete the program, he had worked in the Chicago stockyards, first as a shit-kicking steam fitter's helper, then as a meat seller for Swift. He'd grown up in the rancid shadow of the packing houses in Irish Bridgeport, back of the yards. Workers never got the stench of the place out of their skin, and it was his nightmare to end up there. This was an era when fewer than 1 in 20 Americans attended college, and fewer still went to law school. And of those, most were the sons of the elite. Naively, my father had expected that his success in school would land him a job at a State Street law firm. But after a decade of the Depression, firms weren't hiring lawyers, even from the Ivy League. By the time he graduated Loyola, my father felt lucky to land a job with the FBI. He assumed it would take him out of Chicago, and by 1940, that seemed lucky too. Chicago was a hard-ass town, and young Joe Carroll had seen the roughest of it. As a boy, he'd had to scramble for nickels and dimes to help feed his sisters. He'd collected discarded milk bottles, competing with derelicts. He'd climbed to the roofs of buildings near Comiskey Park to retrieve the Spaldings and softballs and White Sox hardballs that had been lost up there. Once a section of roof collapsed under his weight, which brought him crashing down into the owner's bedroom. His shirt was stuffed with balls. What to do but grin impishly and ask the man if he wanted to buy one. The Yards District was the home of Edward J. Kelly, the mayor and head of the Democratic Party machine. As years later, it would be home to Mayor Richard J. Daley, and then years later again to Mayor Richard M. Daley. After the Capone syndicate was broken by the feds, Kelly's machine picked up the pieces. The mob's lucrative vice industry continued, only now run out of police stations, ward offices, and city hall. Beginning in the mid-1930s, the Kelly machine raked in $20 million a year from illegal gambling alone. At the same time, Kelly, by delivering Chicago to Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, made himself essential to the president, who repaid him with massive patronage through the WPA. Well, he goes on to describe the newsstands and cigar stores were fronts for betting parlors. And his family had to deliver 10 certified votes in every election in order for Joe's father to have a job. So they had a formal system of you owe us 10 votes and you got to collect them. Well, years later, my father, with his party-going days long behind, would describe himself to me as an Irish Jansenist. Jansen was a 17th century Dutchman who held that human nature is incapable of good. His sway was greatest just when Irish seminaries were being shut by the occupying English, and Irish clergy had to go to the continent to learn Catholic theology. Condemned by Rome as heresy, Jensen's ideas had nevertheless found a niche in the besieged Irish church. Eventually, they spread like a virus to Irish American seminaries, in one of which my father was infected. The trouble was that the harsh Jansenist judgment he applied to others, he had first to apply to himself. Incapable of good, my father had reason to think that as much of Kelly, the neighborhood boss, city tyrant, exploiter of his own father, but by the standard of immigrant Catholicism at the deepest level of his existence, my father had reason to think as much of himself. And in his family, he would always be at the mercy of an old self-rejection we would note but never understand. It would inflict itself on me, but not more than on himself. Domine non sum dignus. My earliest memory of my father, from when I knelt next to him in a pew I could not see out of, is the forceful thumping of his fist against his chest. When later I learned the words and gesture meant I am not worthy, I was not surprised. That's also personal to me. My father was very strict about bringing us to church every Sunday. And I remember the part of the Mass in which you have to kneel and you take, sorry, my arm's not right, but you have to take your hand, do it with the other hand. And you beat your chest 3 times and you say, through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. And I'll never forget how that made me feel. It made me feel like there's something wrong in my chest, like I've got a chest. Like it's not like a heart attack. It's just like this, like you're wounding yourself. It's like you beat yourself, and even though you hardly touched it, really, it impacts you in a mental way that, wow, I just beat myself up. Why did I do that? Well, I guess that's one of the reasons I drifted away from the church as soon as I could. I was not somebody that was swept up in this totalitarian belief system that is described here. And maybe that is the difference of 10 years between James Carroll and myself. So it turns out that one of the Irish mafia guys, Roger Touhy, Touhy, had somehow gotten out of jail, and he got surrounded by the FBI, and who was leading the squad but Joseph Carroll, who by then was an FBI agent. Touhy's arrest solved a big problem for Hoover. Still, his commendation might be taken as a manager's hyperbole, but within a year he ordered this FBI kid to Washington, out of Chicago once and for all. He named him chief of kidnapping and bank robbery investigations for the entire bureau. Because of Touhy, Joe Carroll became one of the director's trusted intimates and the trajectory of his rise to the top levels of government was set. My father remained absolutely loyal to Hoover, even after the director had become a parody of himself. And no wonder. J. Edgar Hoover did for young Joe Carroll what the birth of Joe Jr. did for Mary, offering affirmation just when, after having forfeited the affirmation of the church and felt a sense of the affirmation of God, he needed it most. Hoover's letter concludes with the news that as a result of the commendable manner in which you performed your duties in this particular case, I have recommended that your salary be increased from grade CAF 11, $3,800 a year, to grade CAF 11, $4,000 a year. He got a $200 raise, to be effective January 16th, 1943. Well, there's a lot in there that resonates with me as well. Of course, my dad, I believe, remained absolutely loyal to Hoover, even though he certainly would have known. He was also one of those intimate, trusted intimates of J. Edgar Hoover. He also had a bit of what we now recognize as the Jansenist in him. And I think he was one of those unfortunate Catholic kids that grew up in a Jansenist Catholic environment. His family was very, very Catholic, and so he was, but he wasn't at the same time for two reasons. One, that he married my mother, who was not a Catholic and did not become a Catholic, and insisted on not being a Catholic, and she never went to church with us except for a few special occasions. And when she did, it was those times when women had to cover their heads. So she had this little doily thing that she'd put on her head, but she didn't have much respect for the Catholic Church at all. Not that she ever said anything, of course, but she didn't participate. Whereas James Carroll's mother was very, very Catholic and was, as we read, proud to see her son become a priest. No longer living in Washington in 1973, I realized I had an unbroken string of inaugurations going. He's recited that he's gone to all the presidential inaugurations since Eisenhower. Yet when I traveled there that year, it was to join what organizers dubbed the counter-inauguration. The protest was an enraged reaction to the just-past Christmas bombing of Hanoi, which, with 100,000 bombs dropped in 11 days, was the highest concentration of firepower in the war. When Richard Nixon's car approached that year, my spot was at 14th Street, near the district building. The crowd jeered the man who'd kept the war going, despite his 4-year-old promise to end it. My own readiness to join in was a measure of the distance I had come from my youthful worship of these men. I shook my fist and cursed the President of the United States. All my life, inaugurations had been like a sacrament of the streets to me, rituals of rebirth, the one true American gala, a quadrennial instance of Jefferson's peaceful revolution. At inaugurations, even including the glaring exception of 1973, because it was an exception, I learned the basic lesson of this nation, how to put aside what divides us, e pluribus, in favor of a felt experience of what unites us, unum. At inaugurations, we could all wear buttons that said, "I like everybody." Now, isn't that quaint? I mean, our inauguration recently, and not just this one, but the past few of them have been all about "not my president." So, yeah, the divide and conquer continues. The beat goes on. The Roman Catholic Church had set itself against the modern ideas of pluralism and democracy, and it was deeply suspicious of Protestant America. But Catholic Americans knew in their bones that democracy was good, and their influence, especially through figures like the Jesuit John Courtney Murray, was beginning to be felt in Rome. The American experience, filtered through theology, would end the era of Tridentine Catholicism, Tridentine meaning the Council of Trent. My mother and father would be constitutionally incapable of thinking of themselves as ecclesiastical liberals, but they unselfconsciously anticipated the coming breakthrough that would be so powerfully symbolized to American Catholics by the twin, nearly simultaneous arrivals of John Kennedy and Pope John XXIII. With a wartime jumpstart, my parents embraced the life of Washington, of their nation, with a verve that I still remember as the electric pulse that brought me into my first awareness of myself, not only as a citizen, but as a believer. Our father would give us the motto, Pro Deo et Patria, yet he was less the one who initiated Joe and me into the holy mysteries of Washington than our mother. And now he describes the way they were all, whenever they would have an out-of-town visitor, they would pick them up at the airport or the train station and take them on a tour through all the buildings of Washington. And my father did exactly the same with our visitors as we were children. That tour that this son of an FBI agent was in, it's the same tour that my dad gave, I'm quite certain. All right, now I'm finally getting to the chapter 4 called "The Pope Speaks," and I'm just going to read about Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, the man who embodied everything triumphant, timeless, and secure about the Catholic Church, also embodied everything rigid, morose, and moralistic. He was Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, and he figured in my life as the avatar of a piety to which I felt both drawn and condemned. His photograph, a severe face in profile, eyes cast downward, lost in the glint of rimless spectacles, was everywhere in my world. The classrooms of St. Mary's School in Alexandria, the altar boy's robing room behind the sacristy, the cover of The Pope Speaks, a monthly magazine that came home with us from Mass, and framed cheaply on the wall above the plastic holy water font in the front hallway of our house in Holland Hills. Eventually, I went to high school to the Priory School at a Benedictine monastery, one of the rarefied religious communities near the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. He describes it. I didn't even know about it. It's in a place called St. Paul's, and it's up there next to Catholic University. But I didn't know there was this little Catholic church that was there for educating the promising young sons. Pius XII was a decidedly foreign figure to other Americans, brooding, austere, authoritarian. He could have been the stereotype figment of priest-baiting nativists, for whom the papacy had long been the devil's den. Pacelli had been the apostolic delegate to Berlin and an admirer of the Germans. His scrupulous neutrality during World War II, which I would say he was not neutral, he was very pro-German. To him, the Nazi death camps were a moral horror, but so was the Allied bombing of urban populations. Should have made him even more hated in America, but long-standing anti-papal prejudice and leftover resentment from the war gave way in the raw climate of the 1950s to broad American recognition that Pius XII was a crucial ally in the greatest struggle of all, the one against what we knew as, quote, atheistic communism. It was a telling phrase, a key to understanding the odd difference in Catholic responses to fascism and Nazism on the one hand, and Marxism on the other. The premise of 20th century papal politics, from the Vatican concords with Mussolini in 1929 and Hitler in 1933 to Vatican condemnations of class struggle liberation theology in the 1980s and 1990s, is that Bolshevism is a greater threat than fascism. This is so precisely because in its ideology, The former explicitly targets religion, demonstrating what he could have done against the fascists and Nazis, but never did. Pius XII in 1949 solemnly excommunicated with one pronouncement every communist in the world. Coming within months of the Soviets' first atomic bomb test, Stalin's final takeover of Czechoslovakia, and Mao's capture of Peking, the Pope's decisive act endeared him to most Americans. Neutral no longer, the Pope was a powerful ally, and as news broke of priests and nuns being murdered and bishops being imprisoned in China, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, Americans realized that Catholics were on the front lines for them. A Catholic doctor, Tom Dooley, sounded alarms about communists in a place called Vietnam. A Catholic senator, Joseph McCarthy, exposed them in the State Department. A Catholic bishop, Fulton Sheen, preached on television the old dogma of martyrdom in its new form, better dead than red. And a Catholic cardinal, Francis Spellman, would profess the new American faith, our country, right or wrong. Pro Deo et Patria, first my father's motto, then mine. The old thread of conflict embedded in that et evaporated in the warmth of American appreciation for Pius XII. His merciless rigidity and stern moralizing were not derided now, but admired as the very virtues the Cold War needed. Alliance with the Vatican had the practical consequence of undergirding the American sense of moral purity, even as blocks of the American strategy of nuclear deterrence were put in place. In the 1950s, Pius XII set aside his earlier abhorrence of the deliberate mass targeting of civilians. Remember what he said about American bombing of cities. He powerfully reiterated that the Catholic just war theory for the Cold War context, emphasizing its notion of the acceptability of, quote, unintended but predictable consequences, unquote. The deaths of millions in a nuclear exchange were predictable, but according to this casuistry, unintended, and therefore acceptable. Thus, a morality with roots in St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas was used to justify, and my father could articulate it better than anyone, what became known as mutual assured destruction, or MAD. Silencing what little dissent there was, Pius XII declared in 1956, quote, a Catholic citizen cannot invoke his own conscience in order to refuse to serve, unquote, in a legitimately declared war. That absolute repudiation of conscientious objection reinforced the U.S. governments, and depriving them of the appeal to religion that Quakers and Mennonites had, sealed the fate of many Catholic boys. Like his colleagues in the Bureau and the Pentagon, my father welcomed the Pope's statement, I'm sure. As an American, he believed in the right of conscientious objection, but as a Catholic, he accepted the subjugation of conscience. All right, I'm going to stop there as far as reading, just make my closing comments. This just explains how it was that these Catholic guys, the Knights of Malta and the generals, the Joseph Carrolls, could have a pang of conscience about what they're doing and yet put the church ahead of their own consciences to somehow just change themselves into an arm of the Pope and to do the Pope's will, even though it violates their own internal consciences. And of course, that is the divide between General Joseph F. Carroll and his son, the author James Carroll. And it also could have been a big war between my father and me. A number of the things that we talked about here with Joseph Carroll were also true about my dad. And I won't say that my father absolutely approved of the idea of subsuming his conscience under that of the Pope's declarations. I think that's where he had a problem with the Pope, and perhaps that's because he had another 10 years that Joe Carroll didn't have to observe reality. And, he, of course, was in World War II and knew the horrors of real war, as opposed to having been an FBI agent and otherwise. But when you go and look into the assassination of President Kennedy and you look at the Torbett memo, the nomenclature of an assassination cabal, you see that the author places the chain of command as being combined between Hoover and Louis Bloomfield, who was the British, Canadian, American Zionist who ran the, quote, contract agents, unquote, for Division 5 of the FBI at the time of the assassination. And that Louis Bloomfield then would have been working with Joseph Carroll because the DIA and Division 5 were working together to control the Defense Industrial Security Command, the DISC, which is the central topic of Torbett's memorandum, the nomenclature. So I'm trying to figure out where Joseph F. Carroll, how involved was he in the plot and the assassination itself? And was that because of his Catholicism, because of the preaching of Fulton Sheen and Cardinal Spellman and Pope Pacelli? Was that overbearing Catholicism what allowed so many Catholic men to support the war and perhaps even to support the assassination of JFK? Well, this book is helping me a lot. I hope you've enjoyed our reading of some excerpts today, and I will no doubt be finishing the book myself and get back to you with some more that I think we all need to know about Pope Pius XII and the Cold War. Thanks for being with me. I will see you tomorrow with the beautiful Marcia. We will have another Friday edition of McDuff and Marcia, 11 a.m. right here at McDuff Lives. And good luck to everybody today. I hope that Bobby Kennedy does get confirmed and that President wished the new administration all the best success in rooting out the evil that we've had been infused with over many decades. Bye now.